Welcome to Longform, the podcast produced by Jadaliya. Our inspiration for these discussions is a well known quote by Antonio Gramsci: "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is a time of monsters." I'm Mouin Rabbani, and together with my co host, Bassam Haddad, we will be exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has provided valuable insight into these issues. For our first episode, we're absolutely delighted to be speaking with Nesrine Malik. Nesrine Malik is a columnist and features writer for the Guardian paper in Great Britain. She's the author of We Need New Stories, challenging the myths behind our age of discontent and of the myths that subvert freedom. Her work focuses on culture war, globalization, and identity politics. Nesrine Malik, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us on our inaugural episode of Longform.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, Nisreen. We are delighted to have you as our first guest. This is something that we have been looking to do for a while, and here we are. And I'm going to get right to it. This is long form, so it will actually be upwards of an hour. We'll start with a very basic question about what just happened. We're just speaking right now, days after Trump's second inauguration. What's particularly striking about the second Trump administration is that this time people actually knew exactly what they will be getting, and he still won the election. How does this return or his return to power fit into the broader themes you personally and professionally have been addressing in your work over the years?
Just a small, simple question to start off with. So basically, the themes that I've been thinking about for a while, and particularly since 2016, and I referenced in the American book about culture war that Mouin mentioned, is that we don't really think about politics in terms of what's happening in the kind of subterranean area of politics. We only think of politics in terms of how politicians present their policies or their affect in general, or broadly ideology. But a lot of what happens, a lot of the ways in which these democratic processes become hijacked is because a lot of what's happening in the body politic is already quite unhealthy. And because so much of the toxicity and morbidity and illness in Western democracies has been masked by these sort of aesthetically well-presenting liberal and centrist parties, there has never been a meaningful discussion about everything that is underlying political problems. So Trump is seen as a sort of an outlier or a singular calamity rather than an expression of something that everyone owns, not just the right. It's not just the Republican Party going through a particularly extremist time. It's not millions and millions of racist voters. It's not misinformation. All of these things that people are quite keen to cast as the reason for this exogenous shock that is Trump. It's our economic arrangements, it's healthcare, it's health insurance, it's foreign policy, it's housing, it's policing, all of these things that people are kind of not ready to talk about. So the way I think about it, and I've been thinking about this particularly frequently since Trump was elected, and in light of Gaza as well, is that there are so many strong signals that have been sent to the Democratic Party and to liberal parties in general. And these are signals that they do not want to see and sounds that they do not want to hear.
Signals from their base.
Signals from their base, right. Yeah. So, people supporting a ceasefire, or even signals from kind of media messaging or even academic research that there is a crises upon crises.
Crisis, what crisis?
Yeah, exactly. Overlapping crises. And these are sounds and sights that the establishment does not want to hear, because there is too much sunk cost in the system. There is too much literal sunk cost, so too much investment in how things are the way they are, but also too much ideological and value-based sunk cost. So some people really believe that this is the right way to do things, and it would take a lot for them to revise their thoughts. So in brief, Trump continues to be the expression of something that people do not want to acknowledge. And I fear that the lessons have not been learned. Actually, I'm certain that they haven't, because people are still focusing on like the individual figure of Trump, rather than the fact that, or that Kamala was not a good candidate, or that Biden didn't step down in time. These are all relevant factors, obviously, but there's very little confrontation with the sort of bankruptcy of the Democratic establishment in general.
Following up on that, how does the second Trump administration, which admittedly has just started a few days ago, how does it, or how do you believe it will fit into the broader theme of this podcast, which is seeking to determine whether the global order established during the late 1940s is genuinely disintegrating, or is it just being challenged? I mean, we have the experience of the first Trump administration, where business as usual largely recovered once he left office. Do you think this time will be different? And you mentioned a number of domestic issues like healthcare and so on. So, looking both at kind of the cultural agenda of the Trump administration, if you will. Project 2025 has often been mentioned in this respect. But then also looking at his assault on international institutions, such as his withdrawal from the WHO, threats against the International Criminal Court, and all the rest of it. Do you think the international order will survive a second Trump administration? And perhaps also, should it?
And let me just add before, let me complicate this just a little bit, since this is long form. Do you also think that, as what is implied in Mouin's question, in a way, has to do with what happened in Gaza? The genocide has also diminished, if not, more than that, faith in international legal institutions and so on. How might also this figure into the question?
So this might seem a little bit extreme, but I think that order has already disintegrated. I think it's just about whether, again, going back to my first answer, whether people want to confront that or not, whether people want to see that or not. And it feels very much, as Bassam mentioned, hastened by events in Gaza. It feels like it's a zombie order at the moment. We're just going through the motions. And the gap between the rhetoric, the kind of political value-laden speech that people make about human rights, etc., and what is happening on the ground, and the gap between, particularly in the US, rhetoric about the importance of democracy, human rights, etc., is also very large, between that and what has happened since Trump was elected. And so there's these huge gaps forming now between what is happening in real life, what is happening on the ground, and the sort of inertia of those who still believe that this order still exists. So I think it's already disintegrated. And the question is not if or when, the question is what happens now, I think. Does it become a free-for-all? Which to a certain extent it already is, with a few breaks. It's a free-for-all, certainly, for the US and its allies. And to a certain extent has always been a free-for-all for the US and its allies, but with some breaks and some plausible deniabilities, shall we say. So does it become a free-for-all, or does it become a moment of reckoning, right? Does it become a moment where leaders and international organizations face up to what is happening, and try and intervene somehow? And I don't know if this is something that has been already happening in a way. If you look at the way that the heads of human rights organizations and international organizations like the UN and even the Pope, religious leaders, etc., have really been sounding the alarm about the death of the international order as they know it, while the political establishment is again refusing to see, refusing to acknowledge, and in fact vilifying these people when they say this. So there is an effort to reckon with what is happening, and arrest it. But again, sunk cost plus genuine ideological investment in this order for a variety of reasons, I'm sure we can get into that, means that there has been no confrontation. So I think the question is, it's happened. What monsters will appear, I suppose.
And you're basically saying Trump is not even the final nail in the coffin. That has been hit some time ago. And I understand that speculation in such circumstances is very difficult, but you did posit these two quite contradictory scenarios: a free for all or a reckoning. What, based on what you've seen and what you are seeing, would you venture a guess on where we might be heading during the next several years?
Well, the signs are not promising, and whenever there has been that forced moment of reckoning, I would say over the past 10 years now, almost since 2016, since 2016, the Anglo-American politics, essentially the kind of cultural and political undergirding of the world order, which is the UK and the US, have been confronted several times by the need for a reckoning. In the UK, it happened with Brexit, and in the US, it happened with Trump's first election. It's happening again with Trump's second election. And the signs, the record has always been to look elsewhere. In the UK, Brexit, which was essentially a massive howl of discontent on the part of a nation that had lost its place in the world, and had suffered a decade or so of austerity, and had its industrial base and its public services decimated, since Thatcher's government. All of these issues were collapsed into trivial and frankly laughable reasonings for why it's happened. So it was, for a while, it was Russia that caused Brexit in the UK. It was social media. It was Russian manipulation. It was mischievous politicians like Nigel Farage, who managed to whip up anti-immigration hatred, which is true. He did manage to do so. But you don't get millions upon millions of people voting for something because of one reason. It's not just immigration. Even if there was Russian manipulation, it wasn't just manipulation. It was an expression of a fundamental failure in the way British politics and economics has been constructed. No one wanted to talk about that. No one still wants to talk about it. And the energy that went into trying to relitigate Brexit, trying to set up a second referendum, while a left-wing alternative in the shape of Jeremy Corbyn was really gathering momentum, but liberals and centrists decided to occupy themselves with this obsession with Brexit. I thought at the time was a really, really striking expression of what people are interested in talking about, right? Because there was a project that was happening that would address all the reasons that Brexit happened, and no one was interested in talking about it.
Corbyn's project.
Exactly. And actually the energy was spent, and still is being spent, and we can get into that as well, is still being spent on traducing and vilifying left-wing alternatives and left-wing economic arrangements in the UK. That's sort of the obsession of the centre. So that's kind of one example of a moment where the political establishment really was confronted with something and did not want to see it. The same thing happened in the same year with Trump, where we spent, when I say we, I mean the media, spent 4 years basically hyperventilating about every single thing that Trump did, which he did do outrageous things and say outrageous things and passed outrageous and deeply objectionable and dangerous policies. But no one ever asked the question, how, sorry, I'll rephrase that. When people did ask the question, why did Trump come to power? It was always about the fact that the electorate was either malicious, mendacious, racist, misinformed, or stupid. Which is the same way people talked about Brexit voters in the UK. And I mean, if you just stand back from that, it is a blatantly ridiculous thing to think that millions
The deplorables.
yeah, exactly. That like millions and millions of people could all behave in a certain way. And there was also a sort of failure to understand that even if these narratives that people believe in, even if they are mendacious and racist and problematic, it's because the right has managed to sell them. The right has managed to create majorities, whereas the center has failed. And what does that say about your vision? What does that say about what you're presenting as the future for millions of people that you want to vote for you? I'm giving a slightly long-winded answer, but I just think that 2016 was a real opportunity to have these reckonings. And in fact, people ran further in the opposite direction so that they wouldn't have to acknowledge what was happening. A similar thing happened and is happening with Gaza, which is the response to the war in Gaza and the sort of public mobilization that has happened over the past year or so is unheard of, right? Unheard of that a foreign policy since Iraq, but Iraq was kind of localized to the US and the UK because of the way the war was constructed, but the kind of global outrage about Gaza, and particularly on behalf of the younger generation on social media. Politicians not only did not listen to it, but they doubled down on their positions and again ran in the opposite direction. Because to reckon with it, the moment you acknowledge that there is something in it, again, coming back to the point about sunk cost and values, the moment you acknowledge that there is something in this popular support or popular objection to the war, then you have to undo so much. You have to unspool so much. You have to rethink an entire military industrial complex, right? You have to undo decades of economic arrangements and political alignments. And you have to start humanizing Arabs and Palestinians in your head. And these are not things that people can do overnight, you see, because it's too embedded. So in summary, I think it's more likely that there will be a doubling down on a kind of free-for-all that will precipitate or actually continue, not start to precipitate, but continue a precipitation of a confrontation, essentially, between the political establishment and the people. And even though Trump won the popular vote, the anger that people feel and the discontent and the uncertainty will not be domesticated by Trump. It will not be channeled. It will not be satisfied. So it will continue to roil and it will continue to churn in a way that will consume the entire establishment, not just, it won't just be about turfing Trump out of office in another 4 years' time, if that makes sense.
Nesrine, I would like to talk about Great Britain, but before that, I would like to go back a little bit to the question of the global order disintegrating or international legal systems also, more than disappointing us and perhaps even collapsing in some way. when you were saying that, I wanted to ask you if are we witnessing a unique moment, or is it just a function of empirical developments like we have seen over the decades that that break down the global order, and then another is reconstituted based on the same values with very little change? Or are we witnessing a situation where, because of the way it has been happening, because of the disempowerment of publics, because of the enormous power of, for instance, the military industrial complex, because of the unfathomable Western position vis-a-vis the genocide in Gaza, and the US full support, are we seeing a unique moment where the reconstruction of the global order, or the question of international legal institutions, falling apart? Are we seeing a situation where the return to it is a whole different journey, or is it business as usual? Is this a special moment in your mind, or are we going to go back to business as usual based on the powerful brokers?
Yeah, again, we're in the business of prognostication here. I don't see how we go back to business as usual. I just don't see it. Um, Even when you can even see when politicians are kind of coming up with their usual pabulum about the importance of stability, human rights, etc. It just sounds laughable now. It's landing different. It's landing
And
differently than
people are laughing this time.
yeah, people are laughing. It's actually laughable. Like you see even the scenes at the State Department, the way State Department spokespeople have become these figures of mockery. Um, and whenever in the UK somebody tries to, since the Gaza war, whenever a UK politician tries to make some point about Ukraine, they're completely dunked on every time they do so on social media, because it's just so glaring, the fact that there's these double standards that they've applied to Ukrainians and not to Palestinians. And so I think something has been eroded for good. Um, and I think that in tandem with that, two things have happened that would make it hard for us to go back to business as usual. One is, I know every time there's a upheaval of politics, we say this, but one is social media, genuinely. I think that particularly on platforms like TikTok, there is an irreverence and an anger towards the status quo on behalf of younger people that didn't exist before. And the second thing is the world genuinely has changed in the past 10 years. You even just look at the Middle East. Look at how Qatar has become this broker, right? Qatar has become this global diplomatic broker, not just in between Gaza and the Israelis. So we have a sort of economically ascendant Gulf conglomerate of powers that are not necessarily pro-Palestinian, but still have millions and millions of Arabs that live within them, right? And so need to negotiate things very carefully. And so I think that is a very clear difference from kind of the last war in Gaza, for example. You have a war in Europe, in Ukraine, that is paralyzing, stymieing, and slightly seizing up the European political establishment, because it's just this continuous bleed that's happening in the heart of Europe, that makes the ability to behave with abandon far more circumscribed. And you also have ascendant superpowers like China, who have become power brokers in the global south in a way where, when Russia withdrew because of its military commitments, and when America became much more inward looking, China has stepped in. And so even superpowers' ability to marshal smaller countries in the global south and the rest of the world to fall into line, either via threat, incentivization, default, etc., is much diminished. than it was a few years ago. And so the durability or the kind of continuation of the international order depends on two things. One is the validity and respect of international organizations and human rights norms. But the second thing is the ability of superpowers, particularly America, to maintain that sort of facade of plausibility while broadly strong arming and moving other countries around the chessboard to get them to do its bidding. And it can't do that anymore.
The emperor has no clothes.
The emperor has no clothes, but also there's just more emperors in town now.
Mm-hmm.
And so there, I mean, even if you look at the war in Sudan, it's such a localized proxy war, right?
Mm-hmm.
The players are entirely local and regional. They're Egypt, they're Saudi Arabia, they're the Emirates, Turkey, Iran. The Russia is playing a part, but nothing as significant as it would have done before the war, where it was playing a bigger part. And America and the EU are completely absent. And so this has been the most striking thing, as far as I'm concerned, as kind of political observer over the past few years, is that the kind of building blocks of political power and bargaining have really changed. You have a country like the UAE who is openly flouting sanctions against Russia. The Americans can't do anything about it. They put them on a gray list, or they put them on a black list, and they come back on the gray list. And in the meantime, billions of dollars of Russian money are being laundered through the UAE. That would not have happened a few years ago. And one of the things, again, to come back to this notion of self-harm and not wanting or not having the capability to understand that a reckoning is important, is that when you undermine global organizations like the ICC, when you strike doubt and suspicion about the politics and motivations of United Nations employees, when you call UN Secretary Generals biased or anti-Semitic, etc., what you're doing as the US is you're actively undermining your ability to apply those standards when you need to, right? When you need global consensus to sanction Russia, when you need the ability to cut off a country because that's what needs to happen in order to undermine them. The sanctions against Russia have been incredibly porous because of lots of African countries and countries in the Gulf as well. And so just to go back to, what will we go back to business as usual, or is this something new and unique? I think it is new and unique. I really think we're living through a historical moment and people are not catching up. Primarily because things are happening very quickly, but also because the political establishment just does not want to confront it.
Just a quick interruption, Nesrine. We're gonna change the view. So if you can, are you able to see the screen, the three screens? If you can go a bit left and then also a bit up, because somehow the thing went down. Okay. All right, perfect. So we're gonna go from this moment, and I'm gonna do the clap. All right, thank you very much for this, Nesrine. I'd like to go to the UK. You live in Great Britain, which has also recently had a change of government. Keir Starmer has often been compared to his predecessor, Tony Blair, but running even further to the right on various issues like austerity, racism, immigration, and similar issues that are considered central to Labour constituencies historically. What's your assessment of his ascendancy? And if you can tell us about that, both within the party and then to actually, occupying Downing Street.
I'm taking a deep breath here because
we all are.
Oh man, mostly because my frustration at Keir Starmer's government and Labour leadership is high, and also because I think a lot of people have warned and predicted that Keir Starmer would not be an effective prime minister, and were shouted down. When I say a lot of people, I mean me, but we'll go with that. Were shouted down because people were so eager to get rid of the Tories, right? Which were calamitous. Tory party was calamitous, should have gone. But it got
Can I just interrupt and say, so you subscribe to the view that it was more the Tories losing than Labour winning the election?
100%. 100% it was the Tories losing. And what bears that point out is Keir Starmer's polling data just tanking within months of him coming to power. So the Tories very much lost it. They needed to lose. It was overdue. The Tory government had inflicted untold disaster, actually, upon the UK, and in its last years had devolved into farce, essentially. But what Keir Starmer's sort of life cycle is quite interesting, in that he started as more of a nominally left-wing figure. If you compare his statements about certain topics then and now, they're very different. He scrapped almost all the pledges he made when he became Labour leader. He ran very much from the left after Labour's defeat in the last general election, because there was that groundswell of popularity and support for left-wing alternatives. And is a completely different person now. It's quite striking and rather shameless, actually, the way that it's happened. But the logic is, you need to win. People win from the center. Britain is a conservative country, etc., etc. And he also dedicated himself essentially to purging the left from the Labour Party, in a way that was so persistent and almost fundamental to his role, that Keir Starmer began almost every speech by saying, Labour, we have changed the Labour Party, and now we're going to change the country, which I always find very troubling, because I think if you think that your job is to purge left-wing elements from a party to make it more centrist, I don't know how that qualifies you to be a prime minister. These are two very different things. And his and his sort of cohort's insistence on rebranding the Labour Party as the safe, centrist, sensible, non-left-wing alternative consumed them so much that the mask ate the face. And so in government, they don't know what to do. I mean, it's just been very clear over the past few months. Keir Starmer's policies, economic policies, social policies, attitude towards migration, etc., which have always kind of been about tracking as close as possible to the Tories without being as inflammatory or as cruel or performatively racist as the Tories. In government, he's really struggling to distinguish himself in a way that suggests that he knows what to do in power, or that suggests that he has any skills in power other than purge. And so it's a very bleak situation. It's a very bleak government. It is a government that is supposed to have been a sort of a cleansing energy, a cleansing force after the calamity of the Tory government, but has so assiduously and manically focused on rebranding itself as non-left-wing and abandoning left-wing policies, when in essence, all Britain's problems are because there is not enough sort of left-wing solution making, particularly when it comes to the economy. That their kind of economic policies that are focused on growth, trickle down, etc. All these kind of rehashed, reheated, centrist to centrist, sort of right of center ideas about economic prosperity are not coming to pass. And he has also inherited a country that has had a decade of incredibly toxic, divisive, anti-immigrant and racist discourse, and has absolutely no idea how to deal with it. And again, this was something that an argument that people were making, even as he was running for government, saying, you have the opportunity now. You have the opportunity to really change these narratives. You have the opportunity that the Tories are going to lose anyway. So use this time to change the culture. Use this time to take on head on all these toxic legacies of the Conservatives, particularly when it comes to immigration. And he either hid from the issue or tried to outflank the Tories on the right, particularly when it comes to immigration. And when Britain saw really alarming racist riots and pogroms, essentially, in the summer,
This past summer,
his response was really ineffectual, and kind of a security-based response. It was all about, harsh sentences for the rioters,
law and order.
law and order, this will not be tolerated, etc. But and then disappeared, essentially, when it was this like incredibly traumatic and profoundly revealing moment in British politics and society, and he's just like has no idea how to deal with it. And the problem is, when you don't confront these things head on, they grow and they germinate and they turn into something that you cannot control. And so what we have essentially is a government that is hiding. It's hiding from the sort of accumulating racial tension that's building in the country, and it's hiding from the economic contradictions that it won't confront in a way that, because it doesn't want to suggest that it's kind of a left-wing government. And so there's this conversation or this debate about whether it's been going on for a long time, whether Keir Starmer really is so right-wing, or if he feels like he needs to do this because that's what a Labour Party needs to do to get elected, like Tony Blair, and then once in power, move more to the left. And I kind of don't care about that distinction anymore, because I think that, like I said, he was his role, the job that he gave himself, and the job that Labour Party leadership gave themselves was that victory, success, was about eliminating the left. And once that's happened, they don't know what to do.
And speaking of that, I mean, you suggested earlier that Britain was in fact ready for a left-wing project, and we know that in 2017, Corbyn came very close to winning the election, and there has been evidence since then that perhaps the reason he didn't win was because he was being undermined from within his own party, and that there was kind of a Labour establishment that would rather lose to the Tories than win with Corbyn. Be that as it may, in 2019, Labour was massively defeated in the election. And I think you can argue that the internal Labour politics and that Starmer's promotion of a second Brexit referendum probably had something to do with that. But nevertheless, the right won, and won decisively. And also, when you speak about not confronting problems, I remember during the riots last year, Starmer was being criticized for refusing to use the term Islamophobia.
Yeah.
So, are we talking about, let's say, a broader European problem where you have kind of an inexorable rise of the radical right, which has now kind of latched on to Islamophobia as a 21st century version of anti Semitism?
Yeah, I do think we have a bigger problem. And I think that problem has been building for a long time because of the failure of the liberal establishment to confront it. And I think that what really defines the UK, and I think what defines broadly centrist liberal governments across the world, not just Europe, is their inability to fight a fight that they don't think will yield any fruits in the near term, in the short term. So they just keep storing up. They keep storing up problems because they're like, do you not see how toxic immigration is? We don't want to be seen as the toxic pro-immigration party. And while they do that, anti-immigration sentiment and organization builds and builds and builds, right? We don't want to be the party that is seen to be spendthrifty and extravagant when it comes to public spending or public infrastructure. So you store that up and store it up and store it up. And then that feeds into the far right toxicity because people are like, well, we can't get an appointment on the NHS, you know,
Can't
we
heat
can't.
my apartment.
Yeah, exactly. We can't find a place in school for our children, because that's the narrative that is there. And so I think the story really that has defined these parties or has defined the rise of these far right movements is not because the arguments for far right politics are more powerful and more legitimate than the alternative. It's because the alternative had no alternative, presented no alternative, created no majorities, had absolutely no theory of power. There's this notion that exists in this particular Labour Party of politics as a sort of like retail offering, right? So you set up a stall and you present your wares and the people will make a rational decision. When actually politics is about creating a vision and a narrative and a majority in your own image, right? And it's just that this is what the right is very good at. They understand that to convert people towards your cause involves not just presenting them with a policy or with a politics or with an aesthetic or an affect. It's about creating a sense of jeopardy, fear, hope, deliverance, all of these things that energize and mobilize people. And there's a kind of cool, rational, technocratic view of politics that is so completely not only outdated, but disproven at every juncture in history. And I think one of the worst things that could have happened to the left in the UK is Tony Blair's landslide win in the late 90s, because it's just like one event where they're like, it happened, it can happen again.
Yes, and it
But
became the gold standard for
it became the
successful
gold
labor
standard.
politicians.
But it was a very particular time, Anyway, I'll stop there because I could go on forever.
Well, I'd now like then to turn the discussion towards Sudan. You are yourself, of course, Sudanese, and were born in that country's capital, Khartoum, and you've written often and movingly about the country, its politics, and its conflicts. And people often, during the past year, and we've just been discussing this today, people have often been pointing to Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip as a final nail in the coffin of the West's rules based international order. But you've also written about Sudan in this context. And for example, you had a column just last week on 13 January in The Guardian entitled "We Ignore Sudan at Our Peril. The Campaign of Mass Murder and Rape Will Have Global Consequences." So, my question to you is twofold. More generally, how does Sudan fit into this broader theme we've been discussing? And secondly, you've already spoken about it as being a regional proxy war. Where do you see things developing within the country, given recent developments?
So, in answer to your first question, and thank you for raising it, in answer to your first question, I think the theme of this conversation and the theme that is coming up, I think, more and more, and the theme of your the theme of this whole podcast, is that a point of rupture is happening,
Yes.
right? That something is building and something is coming to a head. And that point of rupture only comes if you take all that we've just discussed, whether it's about the election of Trump or the rise of far-right movements in Europe or the war in Sudan. The danger of all of these things and how they develop is because people do not make connections. I think humans broadly are very poor at making connections between things. This is not how we're structured. I think short electoral cycles in Europe and the US make it hard for people to care about connections in 5-10 years time. If you're a government that's on a 5-year tenure, you're not going to think about like what's happening in 10 years time. And I think also we have lived in a world where so many notions that are relevant and salient to mainstream politics are not represented and have not found expression. Okay, that's kind of the top line view. Sudan is a place that has been constantly ignored to the detriment of not just Sudan, but the entire region, and in fact, the rest of the world. Take the refugee crisis, for example, which kind of roiled Europe over the past decade. And they, set up all these schemes to try and stop people coming from Africa or to try and keep them in the Mediterranean in these holding pens, etc. Or even refugees coming from Syria, etc. There is no connection that if you instigate wars, allow wars you have not instigated to continue, or aid and abet your allies in supporting these wars, that refugees will find their way to your shores one day. This is just how it is. This is how
It's
the
always
world
been
has
that way.
exactly how the world has always been. You cannot contain conflict, and you cannot contain any sort of movement to people, whether it's due to climate change, to conflict, to anything. You cannot contain the movement of people. We have not made those connections, and so when people see a war starting somewhere, their first thought should be, it's only a matter of time before there's blowback, either regionally or internationally. So that's where Sudan is something I think that is uncontainable. Already, if you look at how many Sudanese have moved to Egypt over the past year,
Several million, I believe.
millions of Sudanese have moved to Egypt. And millions of Sudanese have moved to Chad. That is already stressing two quite important and sort of quite insecure, volatile countries in their own right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is also little understanding, and this goes back to the point I made earlier about how the world has changed over the past decade or so. There is little understanding of how much more porous the borders of these wars are now, right? Because of technology, because of the development of military armaments, because of the durability of civil wars. You have basically entire militias who are very good at moving from country to country with small vehicles and small arms. So you have a country like Sudan, which has an entire border on the Red Sea, very close to Yemen, right? Very close to Saudi Arabia. You have a port in Port Sudan that is of great strategic importance if captured by the right people. And you also have a kind of low-lying but enduring power struggle in the Gulf between Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia that is playing out on the African continent. And so when people talk about Sudan and they say, oh, it's just such a tragedy, again, there's a war in Sudan, and again, there's ethnic cleansing and genocide, and it's just such a shame this has happened again. I'm like, it's not like the first time. It's not like the last Not that the last time also was not impossible to contain and had knock-on effects. This one is drawing in far more parties in a world where it's far easier to draw in parties.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
You wrote a long profile also some months ago, I believe, concerning what was it, the Rapid Support Forces,
Yeah.
and that you'd looked into them several years ago. Could we maybe discuss that briefly? Because I do think Sudan is a very large country with multiple conflicts over many decades. That I think many people have difficulty wrapping their heads around what is happening in Sudan now. Besides that, there are horrific levels of violence. Lots of people are getting killed, and millions of people are being made into refugees. But I think perhaps if you could take a few minutes to elaborate on your own research and reporting into the RSF and its connections, it might give us all also a better understanding of Sudan today.
Yeah, I mean, the RSF is emblematic of our conversation so far. It's a body that only exists because people refuse to think about the future,
Mhm.
refuse to predict the consequences of their actions. It's almost what's happening with the RSF is almost biblical or Shakespearean. It has a sort of it has an arc of tragedy and inevitability to it. So essentially, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, which is the militia that is fighting with the army for control of Sudan, it's not a civil war in Sudan. I think it's an important distinction. It is a clash between two armed groups. The RSF was created out of the remnants of the Janjaweed, which are the Arab forces that did the government's bidding in Darfur in the early noughties to suppress the rebellion of African tribes in the region. So essentially what happened the first time round, which was much more localized conflict, the conflict now is throughout the whole country, is Darfur was a marginalized part of Sudan. Arab tribes rose up to ask for rights and rebelled. And the military government at the time, couldn't be bothered,
Sorry,
basically.
you mean African tribes rebelled? You said
African
Arab
tribes.
tribes. Yeah,
Sorry, African tribes,
yeah,
forgive me. African tribes revolted. The government in Sudan, the way it wages war is constantly via arming local proxies, because it just doesn't want to lose any of its own people or any of its own soldiers, if that makes sense.
yeah.
So it's how it fought the majority of the war in the south, and it really finessed that model in Darfur. So Darfur is a region where there is Arab and African tribes who have been competing for resources for tens and tens of years, pre-independence even, pre the formation of Sudan as a modern state. And there's always been tensions between them, but at the same time, they have coexisted for centuries in that part of the world. But tensions rise up and are inflamed by climate change, conflict over grazing land, etc. The Arab tribes are non-sedentary tribes, and the African tribes are sedentary. So it's just a kind of clash between those two modes of living and resource gathering. And so the government in Khartoum armed and supported Arab fighters in the region to suppress the rebellion of the African tribes. And in doing so, enabled ethnic cleansing and what the ICC called a genocide in the early noughties. Once the war ended, those militia, under the leadership eventually of the person you mentioned that I wrote a profile of, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's now known as Hemeti, essentially sold a protection scheme to the government and
And which
said,
was at the time still being led by Omar al-Bashir.
exactly, yes, it's
Yeah.
under al-Bashir. And so the remnants of the Janjaweed and their leaders, and particularly one leader, essentially set up a scheme with the government in Khartoum and said, we will be your guard. We will be your sort of Praetorian guard in the West. And generally, we will help you out with other rebellions in the country, because the Omar al-Bashir government was a very centralized, extractive government. And so there was lots of discontent around the rest of the country. So this ragtag group of fighters that were never formalized became formalized. They were given a name, the Rapid Support Forces. They were given a budget, uniforms, arms, and they became part of the kind of broader military structure of the government. This carried on for years. This arrangement carried on for years, with the RSF kind of being deployed whenever the government needed it, almost like an in-housed mercenary force, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But what the Sudanese people didn't realize that during this period, Hemeti, the head of the RSF, was amassing a huge fortune and growing the ranks of the RSF. Because one of the things that he managed to secure as payment for his services was huge swathes of very lucrative gold mining territory in Sudan. And through that, he built a very strong relationship with the UAE, because during the war in Yemen, what Hemeti did was that he basically loaned or leased RSF fighters to fight in Yemen.
This was after the Sudanese government refused to send its military forces to.
Yes, but they did it in a kind of backdoor way, and he got paid very handsomely for it, which is why the Emirates is now so heavily involved in the war in Sudan. And so what happened was, when Omar al-Bashir was removed in a tragically failed revolution in 2019, the power of the RSF became clear. It was always seen as a sort of shadowy group in the background that was just doing dodgy stuff in the West and amassing some power. But what became clear was that it had become essentially a competitor to the army, as opposed to a militia that worked for the army, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so the revolution happened, al-Bashir was removed, and over a period of 2 years, there was a kind of tense power sharing agreement. And once it became clear that there could not be two sheriffs in the town, they fell out. And that's what they're fighting over at the moment. So Hemeti and the RSF, even though they are a force steeped in blood, and are committing horrific crimes in the West and broadly in the whole country, they are a product directly of the Sudanese army. Their tactics and their very existence is because the Sudanese army requested and needed that sort of force to quell uprising in the rest of the country. They just did not think in advance. They just did not think about how much power they were handing over to this party, how much money, how much access and influence Hemeti was gaining in the Middle East and Russia for a long time, because they were only interested in maintaining their power in the short term. And so once Bashir was removed, it became clear that Hemeti had become this towering figure in the background and would not simply be disbanded. Sorry, it's a long story, but it has to be told.
And a tragic one. Yes.
Absolutely. Nesrine, before we get to Gaza and the last question, I would like to ask you about an article you've written that captured a lot of attention, definitely captured mine, in The Guardian, titled "From Beirut to Khartoum, the Arab World is Changing Beyond Our Recognition." You have a quote that I would like to read. And of course, the sentence underneath the title says, "The Arab world is increasingly divided between those who are losing everything and those who have everything. And the quote is, the quote reads,
Bassam, you're muted.
yeah, the quote reads, the scene around across the Arab world looks historically bleak. Fires, big and small, are burning everywhere. Many countries, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, are either divided by low-grade rumbling conflicts. Syria is once again escalating, in parentheses, or struggling through a humanitarian crisis. The tolls of the past few years are staggering, not just in terms of death, but displacement too. The scenes of hundreds of thousands of Lebanese fleeing the fighting over the previous months have been replicated across the region. The legacy is painful, is a painful odyssey of movement, fracture, and uneasy resettlement. Almost every Sudanese person I know within and outside Sudan is huddled with other family members in temporary circumstances, living out of a suitcase, waiting for the next time they have to move again. And they are the lucky ones, safe from the ethnic cleansing and starvation in other parts of the country. What somewhat briefly, but you can address it however you like. What motivated you to write this in December? This was written in December, and can you tell us a little bit more about how the Arab world is changing in all these ways that presumably are pretty ominous?
Thank you for raising that and for mentioning the column. It's a good question. What prompted me to write it? The answer is simply, I just felt very, very sad. I had just been to Ramallah, and every single person I met in the West Bank asked me about Sudan, even in the really extreme circumstances that they were living under. Everyone would be like, "Oh, where are you from? Are you from Sudan? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. What's happening in Sudan? Why are you doing this? It's such a shame." And I came away. There was one particular conversation that I had in a very kind of remote part of the West Bank, where even though I had gone to see and witness really distressing settler violence, most of what people wanted to talk about eventually was my family safe? What a tragedy it is. Why is it always that the leaders fight? And I came away feeling very sad and feeling that there, even though it was really touching to experience that solidarity, incredibly moving and touching because it was mutual. I also felt very sad that this was our common condition. This had become a common condition. This had become like our weather conversation, what's happening in, and other Arabs I had met as well over the past few months, because something about Gaza, I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's just kind of, it reminds me of what it was like during the Arab Spring, where when you meet other Arabs, it was always like, so what's happening in your part of the world? How's your dictator doing? And since Gaza, there has been a heightened sense of that kind of Arab. There's been a closing of the space between, when I've met other Arabs, it feels like you're instantly familiar because you want to talk about Gaza and how it's making you feel, etc. And so even other Arabs that I met, the conversation about Gaza eventually brought up Cairo. It brought up Damascus. It brought up Sana'a. It brought up political prisoners, or it brought up refugees. And I really began to feel that this was the thing that now binds us. The majority, our experience is of war, unsettlement, political persecution, fragmentation, and I just felt like I do not remember a time in my lifetime, or even in my parents' lifetime, who are big Pan-Arabists, where this was the case. And I felt also that it wasn't something that had become acknowledged somehow. Like we were still I felt like we were still sort of, to go back to our earlier conversation about the zombie world order, that there was kind of this zombie approach to what the Arab world was, that we were continuing to take steps and strides and behave as if the Arab world was sort of still the same and this stuff wasn't happening. And it had, and I was very keen to just acknowledge that this is what's happening now. So that's an answer to your first question. And your second question, I've forgotten. Malish, forgive me.
No, I just wanted to, to get a sense of, whether this situation, this condition that is, beyond dire. I mean, we used to think that things were actually pretty grim before the genocide. I just, maybe it's the human need to find some sort of silver lining. Are we in the Arab world? Do you feel that, or do you think we're hitting some sort of rock bottom that will produce something, or along the lines of our earlier questions on the breakdown of the global order and the international legal system and so on? Do you just, one of the questions you really like about prognostication, do you think this is going to go in a direction that might be somewhat redeeming, or do you basically see more? I mean, I hate to say this, but I just don't see the light at this point,
Yeah,
in the short run, at least.
me neither. Yeah, no, basically is my answer. I don't see it either. I think, I mean, when you say we thought we had it bad, we thought it was grim before the genocide. I say the same to my parents' generation when they were complaining in the 80s and 90s. I'm like, you don't know how good you had it. Even then, they were even dissatisfied then. In the 80s and 90s with how things are going. I mean, I'll give two answers to this question. One is no, I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think that what's happening in the Arab world is actually part of a global condition, uh, which is a fragmentation brought about by a retrenchment into consumerism and capitalism. Um, and I think that's something that is universal at the moment. The one thing that defines a lot of Arab governments now, the ones that are still standing or ruling a country that's not divided, is aggressive neoliberal capitalist regimes that have designed their economies and beguiled their societies with the temptation of prosperity. Like, that's what we care about right now. Even when I survey kind of popular Arab culture or discourse, it is a hectic drive towards consumerism and prosperity, and kind of also mimicking the West in a way, or mimicking the kind of affluence or lifestyle of the West, and a convergence between Arab youth in particular, and the kind of global model or the global template of what modernity is supposed to look like. And I don't think this is a particularly Arab affliction. I think it is the result of a kind of much longer wave, where a sort of consumerist, capitalist, lifestyle fixated approach to modernity has defined what people think is progress. And so in one sense, I feel like one of the reasons why things won't get better is because there's just so much money swishing around the Arab world at the moment. Even in countries that are not particularly wealthy, there is a sense that, the Arab Spring produced some very grim years where people struggled, particularly in places like Egypt. And the economy is beginning to recover in ways that are questionable, but people are at least like, now, we can at least start thinking about where we get our bread, and if the tourists are returning, and are we going to get the next loan from the World Bank, etc. So there's a sense that like people want to move on from politics and what politics has done, because politics has not produced good results, and that has converged with this really hectic global consumerism angle. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that there is just nothing to gain. There's nothing to gain from Arab solidarity. There is, as far as leaders are concerned. There's, again, such a gap between the establishment and the people. I know it's a kind of slightly cheesy, corny point to make, but there really is such a huge gap in terms of the kind of public conception of Arabism or who we are. Like, I feel an instant kinship with you, just because we speak the same language, and I assume we have the same cultural references, and political references, etc. And even if you look at the projection of Arab politics and culture over the past 20 years, it has become much more parochial, much more nation-based, rather than expansive and open and outward looking. So that's the second thing. And the third, final thing I would say is, I think that one factor that's really not to be underestimated is, and this is the third time I raise this now because I think it's undercovered, is the kind of the change in the shape and political relationships between the oil-rich Gulf countries. I think that's huge. The blockade against Qatar and that kind of falling out, I think, has had a very big legacy. And that legacy is that Saudi wants to race to Vision 2030. It wants to establish tourism hubs and sweep everything under the carpet and say goodbye to the past and go at breakneck speed towards the future, because it sees that it kind of wasted so much time doing stuff that exempted it or made it lose a lot of the benefits of the kind of modernity that the UAE and Qatar are benefiting from right now. Qatar also has tried to reposition itself as this like big global political player because it's a small country and doesn't want to become stormed by the other bigger countries. And you have the UAE, which has learned the lesson of those years, which is you need to become more powerful, not just as an economic hub or a place where people come to holiday. So those three countries, their political projection, their economic reorientation, their cultural fixations, their taste-making capabilities, I think, are having a huge impact on what people think matters now. Just the way Saudi projects in the past couple of years, the way it has flooded social media with these like renderings of a new Saudi Arabia, that's aspirational. That's what other people aspire to in poorer parts of the Arab world. And so, just to wrap it up, I think that all of these things converging mean that there is very little space for people to think about the stuff like old people like us think about, solidarity, pan-Arabism, etc. Having said that, there is still something there. Like I said, everybody I have spoken to, and it has been brought to the fore by Gaza, that at the end of the day, you cannot, and this is where I'm kind of an optimist in spirit and a pessimist in practicality. I think the spirit, there's no way you can eliminate that spirit. It endures. It's the largest same language speaking bloc in the world. It has too many connections and too many actual physical and relational links, right? Like, I have family who live in Egypt. Even before the war, I lived in Saudi Arabia. Like, we've all lived and interacted with each other in so many different ways that when an event like Gaza happens, suddenly all of that stuff falls away, and you're like, all you hear is somebody who talks like you and feels like a brother or a sister. And I think that is something that is it can't be created and it can't be destroyed. And I think one of the reasons actually that it's been so hard to express publicly support for Gaza in a way that we've seen in London or Paris or New York in the streets of the Arab world is because these governments know that once you unleash that sense of fraternity and
It goes
solidarity
everywhere.
and anger, it cannibalizes you. Yeah, because it's something that these governments constantly have to keep under wraps. They constantly have to deracinate and fraternize, that's not a word, deracinate and sort of de-relation, if that makes sense. We like constantly break the links between us and deracinate us
So,
as Arabs.
so in a way, we need, as the title of your book says, new stories.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull up your book here. Your book says, we need new stories, the myths that subvert freedom. So, do you want to, very quickly, before we move to the last question on Gaza, do you want to sort of connect this to what's in this volume, which has been celebrated? But I'll let you just make the connections quickly, because as you were speaking, I had wanted to ask a different question, but you actually went into a very similar topic in terms of being hopeful, in terms of addressing what might be needed. So I'll let you just close a bit with reference to your work.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I wrote this book, actually, I'm pretty sure this is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that I think when you grow up in the Arab world, you become very accustomed to the notion that a lot of what is mainstream political convention is manufactured, right? It's something that is manufactured by powerful governments and powerful people. And it's very hard to explain to people in the West that you develop a kind of transactional, cynical relationship with government, right? Which is like, they're lying. That these lies convince some people, but broadly, most people don't buy it. But what are you going to do? This is our government, and this is kind of what we all need to say is the public line. But broadly, I think you become quite acculturated and acclimatized to myth making. You grow up under so many myths in the Arab world. Myths of history, myths of religion, myths of supremacy, like all these things that you grow up with. I certainly grew up with in Sudan and the Middle East. And I just think Westerners just don't understand that a lot of that is happening in the West as well. It's and the through line of this book and the other book is that, and I kind of mentioned this as well in the book, is that just because these governments are ostensibly more democratic and more representational than the kind of evil, cartoonish dictatorships you see somewhere elsewhere, doesn't mean that they are not expressions of establishment thinking that has a vested interest in presenting you with a history in which you are this noble liberator, right? As opposed to a colonizer, or where your country was created by brave pioneers from the UK fleeing persecution, as opposed to people that had to ethnically cleanse the natives that they found there to set up their country. So like all these things, to me, are not, they do not shake my conception of myself or who I am, because I just grew up knowing that establishments need to concoct myths in order to perpetuate their legitimacy. But when you say these things to people in the West, particularly in the US and the UK, which these two books are related to, like it really shakes them to the core.
But we're different.
So we're built different. Yeah.
For our final question, I'd like to turn to an issue that has come up repeatedly during our fascinating discussion today, and that is, of course, Gaza. But rather than discussing Gaza as Gaza, I'd like to pose a question in the following manner. What, in your view, is so distinctive about this? Because, when you think of the 1982 invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra Shatila massacres, when you think of decades of US vetoes in the Security Council, when you think of the European Union, always with its hypocrisy between the lofty rhetoric and the opportunistic policies, when you think of the inertia of Arab governments, I'm trying to understand what has been so distinctive about the current genocidal campaign that has gripped the conscience of the world, in the region and in the world, in ways that previous episodes have not, because it seems to be more than just a difference of scale.
I think the difference of scale is relevant. It is that the scale is off the scale, even by the stat. There's all these reports now. One from Air Wars in particular, which
Yeah,
is the most important one, I think,
yeah.
about how it's the most intense bombardment and mortality inducing campaign in the 21st century. So I think the scale is important. But the second thing, very simply, it is pictures and it is footage. And we
Mm,
just didn't have that in the 1980s. One of the most striking things about uh, reporting on Gaza generally over the past few months is the number of people who are completely non-politics people. People in my immediate circle, people I interview who don't even know anything about Israel Palestine, right? So that before you would get people who would be interested or energized, or people that could name all these events that you've
mm,
named, the vetoes, the massacres, the Nakba, etc. This has all become mainstream now. People are swatting up, and
mm,
like they've learned all this stuff because they have seen images and they have seen footage, and that is not. I think when people ask this question in bad faith and say, "Oh, why this time? Why
mm.
this time do people care about what's happening in Gaza? Is it because they agree with what Hamas did on October 7th?" And I just say it's really simple. People did not wake up every morning to see decapitated babies on their phones before. It's never happened anywhere, let alone in Palestine. And I think this is just to go back to prognostication. I think one thing that we have not understood or even paused to think about is this is the first time the entire global population has had its eyes and ears and kind of informational networks plugged in live into a genocide on a daily basis. I don't know what that does to
Mm.
people. Honestly, I don't know. Like, it's not happened before. That kind of big site, and it's also not meant to happen. We are not constructed to see and experience these kinds of things remotely. Um,
Particularly one that is being broadcast in equal parts by victim and perpetrator.
exactly. That
Mm,
exactly. That's going to be my next point. Is that you see also that in what radicalizes people, quote unquote. This is the second element, which I think is super relevant. Um, is that they find that they're being told not to believe their own eyes and ears, right? They are seeing things on their phones from victims in Gaza and from the West Bank, and they're being told that that's not what you see. When you say that to people, that tends to piss them off, right?
mm,
And it tends to make them ask questions. And this is another, going back to not reckoning and not wanting to understand that a moment is upon you. What has happened with Gaza, and I wrote this very early into the war, it's a thread, right? And in the beginning of the war, that people were beginning to pull that thread and say, well, if you're lying about something as obvious and straightforward as this, what does that say about your entire political project, right? It's a loss of faith in something much bigger than Israel Palestine. And so it's tapped. So three things: scale, second, imagery and footage. Third, gaslighting, essentially, is what has made this very different. And I don't know, this is, I think it should be a concern. Psychologically, spiritually, politically, what emerges after this, right? I think just going back to your question, Bassam, about what happens on a kind of power level, I think a corollary to that question is what happens on a citizen level, right? What happens to the kind of global body politic? Do people then just lose faith in politics altogether and it becomes a nihilistic free-for-all? Do people become much more oriented around communities and doing their own work? I just don't know what that, I just think there's like a massive reverberation that's going to come from people having their nerves plugged into the mains of all this death and cruelty and almost and brazen denial of what is going on, and exposure of the real ugly underbelly of what makes the world tick in this way, like a real exposure of the kind of stuff that before only people that were considered to be radicals or or like conspiracy theorists or whatever would make. And now everyone is making these points out in the open.
Communist jihadists, I think, is a current term.
Exactly. Like you don't hear that language anymore. You actually don't. People, there has been, I mean, this is again to come back to the kind of spiritual positivity. There has been a massive enfranchising of Palestinians in the public domain over the past few months, because all that has been done hitherto is to disenfranchise them, to carve them out of humanity and human rights and grief and ritual and all of these things that we extend with such elaborateness to other people's lives and tragedies. And even though the price is very high, I don't think we can go back. I honestly cannot see a world in which we go back to the status quo of, 10, 15 people a month being killed in the West Bank on a regular basis, and skirmishes every few years, and few thousand people dying in Gaza every few years. It's not going to happen. Even now, I don't know if you've noticed, even though West Bank killings have escalated, news coverage of the West Bank is different to what it was a year and a half ago. Because people care now and people are interested. So I think practically, just to go back to the original question, practically, I don't see things moving in a direction of resolution and solidarity and sort of strong group block pressure in the Arab world. But I also do not see a world in which the Palestinians go back behind the veil again.
Okay. Yeah, that was great.
That was phenomenal. She has such a wide range and is so eloquent. Really phenomenal.
I could have gone on. I mean, we had questions about identity and a number of other topics, but I'm glad
there was a clear thread running throughout the conversation, I felt too.
Yes, absolutely, and we kind of tried to end at in a positive manner. We'll see. Who's next, Mouin?
Yeah, well, we have a few victims that we have identified, but none yet confirmed. So hopefully, in the
Allah
next
we are recording this. Why would you say not yet confirmed?
No, sorry, no, just in the sense that we don't have.
I'm Bimza,
Well,
I'm
who
joking.
next? Have you spoken with Mersheimer yet?
Not yet, but we have a couple of others who are actually, considering. Yeah, so we'll see.
Okay, so you want to ask me again?
لا خلاص ما نحن the whole idea is to be straightforward. We'll keep all that. طيب حبيبي.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, Bassam.
Thank you. Take care, حبيبي.
Talk to you soon.
Salam.
Bye.